Helen Salinari, everybody.
Feeling like my ear's about to fall off, but all right, hold on a second while I get it a little tighter. Yes, just me, I'm about to fall apart here. Okay, so good morning. I am one of the organizers, and Frode asked me to talk, and at first I asked him why. So I'm a scientist, I'm a protein chemist, cell biologist, genomics expert, and I've been really fascinated by this idea of how we handle knowledge, definitely coming from the genomics world and doing annotation on a genome is an area that I have some experience with in terms of big data, but text, I wasn't so sure. But I would say that when I thought about the why, there's actually a bigger why. So the bigger why for me is the why of the planet and what's going on the planet. And I think my first indication that something was quite a bit off was one of my son's friends, his mother was working on the Delta smelt issue. And about probably 8 to 10 years ago, there was a crash in Delta smelt population, which is a feeder species here for the California Delta area, by like 85%. And they have some different theories as to why, and she's been working on breeding programs, et cetera. But that's a starkly shocking number for a scientist. And it turns out that I think the big why is that as a scientist, if you look at population numbers for major species across the planet, we are in a time where if I were a wild Atlantic salmon or if I were a cod, I wouldn't be asking why. I would either be part of the 90% that's died off in the last 10 to 30 years, so I'd be wherever you go after you die, or I would be experiencing a very different environment. And so for me, the major why is that why. And I want to bring two different ideas to this conversation. I want to bring in a third dimension about text. So one of the things that I have learned is really important in terms of working with any kind of data, knowledge, information, conversation, is that it's the space between. It's the container. It's not just what I have over here in my mental model. It's not what you have over there. It's actually what we're creating between us. So whatever we do, it needs to have a container where, and it was Bob last night that gave me this beautiful vision of, around text, people used to stand, and I don't want to steal your thunder, but to stand with a space between. The text was between at the feet of all of the scholars. This is where we're at right now. The text needs to be between our feet. And the reason is, one of the major reasons is what I want to call fuzzy, the need for a fuzzy container. If you've been tracking what's going on in science at all, in the pharmaceutical, biotech, et cetera, John Ioannidis, who's just, I think, up the street at Stanford, there's what they call the reproducibility issue right now. There's a fundamental shift in understanding the basics of math. There's a question about the number 1, right? 1 is different than all the other numbers. There's a question about all of these datas, and basically John had done a study of gene associations, and he was a mathematical child genius in Greece, and he's a doctor, and he's a mathematician, and he came out with a result showing a negative gene association for a particular type of disease state. And a colleague of his, a trusted colleague, came out with the exact opposite result that they happened to publish at the same time. And he got really interested in how can this be, because we both know our math, right? We both know our math really well. So he went through all of 70,000 different studies in biotech and pharma over the last, I don't know how many, I think 2 decades. And he found where the fundamental issues are in our math right now. Why is this important? Well, one, Amgen has also done a study where they, out of 110 of their own top cancer drug trials, they found they could only reproduce about, I think, 11 of them. So we have a reproducibility issue that we didn't realize we had. We have an actual truth issue that we're coming to in the world of science about what is truth. And where this is in our mental models, right? We have to be able to look at what is the actual truth. There is no real truth. There's our mental models, and what we think about things, and there's the need to actually create a space between that we can modulate and we can touch and we can move and we can shift this and shift that. I call it fuzzy. We need a fuzzy container for our knowledge so we can work on it right now because we're going through a major shift. And why are we going through that shift? We have to actually understand these things in a way that will impact those wild Atlantic salmon. Complex problem, wicked problems. I loved Bob's visual language that I found out about a few years ago. I'm like, oh, scientists and engineers will really love this because we can externalize our implicit maps and we can start actually thinking about them externally. I absolutely love Howard's work on co-learning. So that brings me to the last part of this fuzzy container. The most fundamental part of this, I worked in genomics for a while, and I used hidden Markov models to annotate a genome. And I found out all the different sequencing centers around the world are all using different annotation platforms. And it turns out if you're a species that is sequenced in Japan, your proteins will be called different names than if you're a species that's sequenced at Walnut Creek or somewhere else in the world. And if you do a BLAST analysis, which is the basic entree that almost everybody uses because it's quick, you won't discover this. So the data is a mess. We've made a hash out of it. But it's not the technology that's our issue. It's the human-to-human interaction. So that's why the co-learning means so much to me, because at the base of this is the human interaction. So we have to create some kind of fuzzy container that has room for us to connect person to person so that we care. So we care about each other. So when we come across those inevitable misunderstandings, different directions, maybe even different visions, that we have the fabric and the wherewithal and the depth and the ability, but mostly the interest, to get through them and to learn together. So that's my message. It's 3D. This text needs to be 3D. It needs to be a fuzzy container. It needs to be handleable, and we need to get along together and have ways that are embedded in the technology that create that structure. So I'm done early, I think. Never too early. So questions. All right.
Yeah, thank you for doing the karaoke thing. Otherwise, I'll take forever to live up there. This will touch on, as you'll see, somewhat one of the problems I've got, which is how do you handle ancillary outcomes in research where N=1 can often be meaningful and insightful data.
Yes.
But in the wake of the Lancet scandal with the autism, the so-called association between the preservative agent and the autism vaccine, case series are absolutely, the BMJ won't even take a case series. And some of you
Big
might
problem,
know
right?
V.S. Ramachandran developed phantom mirror therapy for phantom limb pain on the case of a single individual.
Yes.
And we have the unanticipated outcomes with a lab that I often collaborate with, and I'll present some of that data here.
Good.
And it's just impossible to even get a journal to take it. So how on earth are scientists supposed to communicate what could be groundbreaking findings in a way when journals won't take a single case, let alone even a case series?
I have a very strong opinion about this.
I hoped you would.
So my opinion is that scientists need to learn how to listen. And part of what the background of that is that there's an issue about vaccinations, because it just seems to me as a mother that there isn't a cultural understanding within the scientific community that it really takes something as a mother when your young baby or child is being vaccinated and you sign off on that release that says 1 in 10,000 or 1 in 15,000 will have an adverse reaction. There's no heart to listening to that concern, and out of that crops things where people are grasping at what might be going on here. Science has turned a blind eye. There are studies that got latched onto by an audience that feels that they're not listened to. The N=1 is a really big deal, actually. So that, again, is the aspect of listening to, it's almost like listening to the cod, listening to the Atlantic salmon. Like, what are we paying attention to on an N=1 basis, on an individual, like, these are the organisms that we share the planet with basis? For humans, N=1 is absolutely essential, because if, you know, slightly over 50% of our budget for R&D in this country is life sciences. Why? Because we care about being well. Why? Because we want to have a life that we enjoy.
Do you think it's possible to create an open source equivalent of PLOS One for N of one?
Well, I'm afraid I'm blanking on his name, but there's somebody who was a very successful, I want to say industrialist, but very successful business person who created an N of one database site for cancer patients, et cetera. So there is something on the move in this area. But N of one is a matter of, that's what big data will allow us to do. The N of one approach, absolutely. There's a lot of movement in this area, so the answer is yes. And already some has been done in this area. Oh, sorry, John. You first. John, okay.
Hi, thank you. So this, you partially answered this, but just, I very much like the idea. I was a little nervous when you said fuzzy. And I said,
you know, it's supposed to make you nervous.
I know, and I said, why am I nervous? And I said, oh, I'm nervous because I've encountered binary skepticism. Meaning it's got to be, you know, and what are the questions? Right? What are the questions the media has? What are the questions the public has? Is this true or not? Does this work or not? So what the fuzzy container needs to have, I mean, the N or N of one is great. That's the beginnings of a fuzzy container. But another one is, you know, to sort of train people, and the comeback is, we're looking for the parts of this that are true, or we're looking for the parts of this that are not true. I mean, right now, if an expert says that in response to a reporter, it sounds irresponsible culturally at this point. But that needs to change. We need
well, something's on the move here. So one thing that I recognized a while ago, and I want to check, Frodo, I have a little extra time for questions, right? Okay. Precision in language is very important. So if you're talking about the rough endoplasmic reticulum, and you're talking about protein foldings, and you're talking about alpha helices, and you're talking about the nitrogen-hydrogen bonds, et cetera, you have to use precise language or you're not talking about that thing, right? So there's absolute need for precision. It was at a talk at Berkeley when one of my favorite people, Uri Elan, who's from Israel, and he's been spending time at Harvard and in the US, and he's a systems biologist, and he was talking about systems regulation for upstream regulatory regions and genomes. And you could see everybody in the audience was taking what he was saying, and they were mapping it right onto what I like to say is page 392 of Bruce Albert's Molecular Biology of the Cell, right? They're mapping it onto a mental image that's very complex, that's our scientific understanding of how it works. The fuzziness is that how it works isn't working completely anymore, and we haven't loosened up the edges enough. We've concretized what we understand, such that there's no room for unexpected results. Like CRISPR-9, everybody's been seeing these repeat regions, but she got interested in what wasn't fitting. So there's absolutely a space for precision, but holding on to it like there's truth, that's where the mischief is right now.
Okay, thank you.
You had, Andrew, sorry, thank you.
I was just wondering if, because you talked about the container as being important for... a
technical test.
Hello?
Very good job.
Okay. In terms of scientists publishing, you know, N=1 studies, the container could be important, but you think the mental models that the scientists themselves have as to what constitutes a result could be a factor too? Because, I mean, if you're allowed to publish data openly, instead of data plus a conclusion or some, you know, that would allow on many of these results to be published without it having to...
We're in a deluge. We're in an onslaught. We're in an absolute firestorm of data right now. So I think that that's what terrifies people about the idea of N=1. But we're here to talk about the future of text and the future of how we communicate. And so that's where the value lies, is being able to communicate differently to be able to deal with that deluge. We have the capability. And the interesting thing is we have an ever-increasing, if you read The Coming Jobs War, we have an ever-increasing amount of unemployment. Well, gosh, there's a lot of good work to be done, right? So thank goodness we have a workforce that we could actually engage. I would say if we're termites, this is my recent thing, if we were termites, we'd be organizing ourselves a bit better. We'd be putting people to work. All right.